So many people have asked me what is a rare book over the years, and I'm going to answer that once and for all by saying I have no idea. The term is so abused throughout the rare book world that it's almost meaningless. Sometimes a book is considered rare when it was done within the last 50 years, but it happens to be very popular and therefore very expensive. Other times, books from the very beginning of printing have no interest among libraries or collectors or dealers, and so it could sit on the shelves forever without anyone even coming near it. What I can do is talk about the definition of an antiquarian book, or said another way, my definition of an antique book. And the definition of an antique book is very simple, and there's hundreds of millions of them. A book made by hand from the very beginning of printing in the 15th century until the rise of modern printing techniques in the first quarter of the 19th century. Why is it an antique book? Because it's such a different format than the modern book as to be a different object. And secondly, that the printing runs were by and large so small, although not always, that there's a very good chance that they will become rare technically. In other words, there will only be a finite number of them held in institutions or none at all, and they cannot be found. The book is one that's made by hand to a large extent. You can see this example very clearly by looking at the cords here. These are sewn by hand to attach the block of the book, that is all the pages, to the inside of the inner covers. You can see the tapes underneath there, the cords. And that's so that the book can remain adhering to its covers. Another good definition of an antique book is one that has paper that's made from beaten rags, and that's the way things used to be done. If you can, maybe if you're lucky, you can see the lines of the horsehair in the pages itself near the watermark. This is because the paper was made from beaten rags and then beaten into a pulp, and water was added, and then when the paper was manufactured, it was poured into a form, into a tray, through which all the water seeped, but the paper glue stayed on top and it hardened. A long, complicated process. The type was set by hand. You can see each letter had to be installed into a form, and then each line had to be corrected and then printed. And the engraving in the front is an example of a fine engraving, but one that's very time-consuming to make because each line had to be cut in copper with a burr individually, unlike modern printing methods, which I'll show you in just a second. So this book, which is a novel from the Baroque era, an Italian novel, Il Dragone di Macedonia by Luigi Mancini in 1643, is an antique book. It doesn't mean it's valuable, it just means it's an antiquarian object. It's one of hundreds of millions. Books came out in printed editions from the middle of the 14th century, and by the end of the century there was already millions of physical volumes on the planet. And this is just in the West. We're not talking about other parts of the world about which I don't know much. Okay, so that process of hand making the paper, setting the type, making the binding individually, engravings or etchings that took a lot of time and could only be done in in small print runs, relatively speaking. existed until the early part of the 19th century. Here's two examples of books that are modern with a new type of printing process. And if they're rare, it's only because that they were read out of existence. It's not because they were printed in with such a limitation. This is a little paperback version of Cinderella done in York, England in the 1820s. It could have been printed in 500, 5,000 copies, as many as were needed. The paper was made through a whole completely different process, through wood pulp, and that's why later iterations of paper turn yellow. They become very acidic. The wood engravings are done very hurriedly, and they're reprinted until they're almost illegible. They've lost all their sharpness, and the binding, if there is such a thing, is just slapped on. This actually doesn't have one. Here's a little edition of Robinson Crusoe from the same period, which does. Because it's machine made, because it was made in a large edition, does not mean it's valueless. Value has nothing to do with rarity. Value is only connected with popularity. Let me give you one final example. This is a case binding. This is a full example of a machine-made book. It's the works of Christopher Marlowe, done in 1826 by William Pickering, a great printer who used all the latest technology. The binding is slapped on and glued down, or it's got a whole layer of mesh there that it adheres to the block of the book. It's not a very sturdy binding, but it serves its needs. It has a printed label, and it is a great example of something from the machine age. Next time, I'll talk about what's the nature of value.